now it's time to introduce our friend Sheffield Hale, who has a 22-minute prepared remark, which he practiced, right, on an unusual story that I think contains lessons for us all. Everybody knows Sheffield, I think. He was born in Atlanta. His dedication and enthusiasm for the work of the Atlanta History Center is rooted in his strong sense of community and a desire to preserve and explore Atlanta's history. That sense of community, along with his legal background and non-for-profit board experience, shapes the approach to leading the History Center. Under Sheffield's leadership, the Atlanta History Center is focused on addressing issues of history and memory that divide our community and our country. Two key aspects have been the Center's nationwide Confederate Monuments Initiative, which focuses on providing historical information and tools for communities deciding whether to contextualize, stop pacing Sheffield, to remove or otherwise engage with monuments or named places, as well as the development of guiding principles defining how the center will approach history in a way that cultivates broader community-wide perspectives. It reminds me of my hero Nelson Mandela, who says you cannot erase history, you can only confront it and learn from it. Sheffield has served on many boards and commissions, namely for historic preservation, cultural and civic organizations. In recognition of his work, he has been named one of Georgia's and Atlanta's 100 most influential people in various media, and was a 2021 recipient of the prestigious Governor's Award for Arts and Humanities. A little known fact, in Sheffield's office in the History Center lies a lot of the beloved artifacts of this club. I showed you a couple of months ago Ivan Allen's membership thing. Can we all implore Sheffield to put a show on at the Atlanta History Center about what the Atlanta Rotary Club does? Please? We are so privileged to have you a part of the club, and we look forward to your remarks. Welcome, Sheffield.
Thank you, sir. I've got Claire Haley, our Vice President of Special Projects, which means handling me. And author programs. So all the author programs that come, she is in charge of, and she's the best. So I really appreciate y'all inviting me on such short notice. And so I may not have had time to actually memorize these remarks. So I have some prompts up here, so I'll have to go through that. But today I want to talk about something that we're all familiar with, echo chambers. I want to think about an interesting time in American history, a time when people retreated into circles where everyone agreed with each other and completely ignored other perspectives, where people were reading the same information and coming away with exact opposite conclusions, and were fully convinced of their intellectual purity, insisting on canceling opinions that didn't align with their own. Sounds like something you've heard before? Of course it does. It's about America in the 1930s. Here I have two images, each featuring an award-winning Atlanta author whose work, published just 7 months apart in the mid-1930s, shifted American culture. They are Margaret Mitchell, author of Gone with the Wind, and W.E.B. Du Bois, author of the succinctly named Black Reconstruction in America, an essay toward a history of the part which black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct American democracy, 1860 to 1880. Mitchell and Du Bois both wrote books about the Civil War and Reconstruction, the roughly 12-year period that followed the close of the war. Despite their similar choice of topic, their books and their impacts could not have been more different. Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind was a romantic, dramatic novel of the Civil War. It was firmly sympathetic to the Confederacy. In 1936, New Republic critic Malcolm Cowley famously called it an encyclopedia of the plantation legend with all of its episodes and all of its characters and all of its stage settings, with the war between the states, sir, and the twins riding off on their fiery chargers, and the lovely ladies staying behind to nurse the wounded, and Sherman's march. Then the black days of Reconstruction, the callousness of the carpetbaggers, the scallywaggishness of the scalawags, the knightliness of the Ku Klux Klansmen who frightened the Negroes away from the polls, thus making Georgia safe for democracy and virtuous womanhood. And our Jean Talmadge. It is all here, every last bale of cotton and bushel of moonlight, every last full measure of Southern female demotion, working its lily-white fingers uncomplainingly to the lily-white bone. Another term for the plantation legend so floridly described by Cowley is the lost cause. Like many historians in the early 20th century, Mitchell presented an inaccurate and racially charged pieces of the lost cause narrative as part of Gone with the Wind. W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, on the other hand, was a carefully researched academic work written with the explicit intention of countering biased histories like the ones Mitchell relied on and reproduced. In the introduction to Black Reconstruction, Du Bois wrote that his book was going to take a novel approach to the Civil War history and slyly suggested that, quote, "The Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under a given environment develops like other human beings." Mitchell and Du Bois were themselves very different people. Du Bois was almost twice Mitchell's age. She was 67 when Black Reconstruction was published. He was 67 when Black Reconstruction was published in 1935. Mitchell was 35 when Gone with the Wind was published in 1936. Both of them spent a lot of time in Atlanta. Du Bois spent 23 years of his 95 years here, while Mitchell spent all but one of her 48 years in the city, usually living along Peachtree Street in Midtown. Du Bois, when he wasn't in Atlanta, lived all over from New York to Ghana, where he died in 1963 on the day of the March on Washington. Mitchell spent her year away in Massachusetts studying at Smith College. Mitchell's year at Smith was her only higher education. Du Bois, on the other hand, had 2 bachelor's degrees, and one from Fisk and one from Harvard. He also had a PhD from Harvard and was the first Black man to ever earn one. He followed up this impressive academic record with postdoctoral work in Germany. Charming, vivacious, and private, Mitchell belonged to one of Atlanta's oldest families. Du Bois, born in relative poverty in Massachusetts, was extremely intelligent and bold. He lived his life in the academic and activist spotlight, fighting racial discrimination across the United States, but particularly in the Jim Crow South. However, the most revealing differences between Mitchell and Du Bois isn't the details of their lives and personalities. It's the way their books were received. Gone with the Wind has been astronomically popular with generations of readers and filmgoers. It sold 1 million copies in its first 6 months. Many readers lauded it as being remarkably historically accurate, so seemingly accurate that in fact, to this day, people come to Atlanta hunting for its fictional characters and locations. Black Reconstruction wasn't so stunningly successful with the average American reader, but it was popular in some academic circles. Black scholars and critics heralded Black Reconstruction as revolutionary. It contradicted the biased arguments of many historians at the time that Reconstruction had failed due to Black men being granted civil rights. A surprising number of white scholars in the New York celebrated the book as well. Eleanor Roosevelt read it and tried to get her husband to read it, but we don't know if she succeeded. Even so, a significant portion of the white establishment, think publications like The New Yorker, disdained Du Bois's focus on the history of Black Southerners as, quote, an odd view. For all their differences, Margaret Mitchell and W. Du Bois lived only 4 miles away from each other in Atlanta. Mitchell wrote the majority of Gone with the Wind in her apartment on the corner of 10th and Peachtree Streets, now the Atlanta History Center's Margaret Mitchell House, while Du Bois footnoted Black Reconstruction at his office in Atlanta University. Margaret Mitchell's interest in the Civil War and Reconstruction was lifelong. Her parents, Atlanta attorney Eugene Mitchell, a founder of the Atlanta History Center, and suffragist Maybelle Stevens Mitchell were both dedicated students of Civil War history. Mitchell often joked that their knowledge of the war was so expansive that it took her years to realize that they hadn't experienced it personally. Mitchell, who was born in 1900, spent many weekend afternoons as a child listening to her parents and grandparents and their friends refight the battle or tell stories about the war. These stories are, of course, steeped in the nostalgia and rhetoric of the lost cause. Atlanta History Center recently bought that chair, by the way, but we couldn't get our hands on the cat. Du Bois began researching the Civil War and Reconstruction around 1900 when he was in his late 20s. He took a teaching position at Atlanta University in 1897 and published his first article on Reconstruction in 1901. Just 2 years later, in 1903, here in Atlanta, he published his iconic The Souls of Black Folk. His article on Reconstruction embodied Du Bois's intention to counter biased arguments like those of contemporary historian William Archibald Dunning. Hailing from Columbia University, Dunning and his graduate students were known as the Dunning School. Columbia, there they go again. Anyway, Dunning, who was born in New Jersey, was one of the first modern historians and one of the first Reconstruction scholars. His work gave legitimacy to the idea that Reconstruction was a failure. His argument was steeped in racial stereotypes, arguing that black people were not ready for suffrage, and lamenting the fact of the unfairness of federal policies to white Southerners. He wrote, "7 unwholesome years were required to demonstrate that not even the government, which had quelled the greatest rebellion in history, could maintain the freedmen in both security and comfort on the necks of their former masters. The demonstration was slow, but it was effective and permanent." In 1910, Du Bois took his work a step further and presented his research to the American Historical Association at a meeting attended by Dunning himself. This was the equivalent of an academic cage match. Picture this: Du Bois took the stage and argued to Dunning's face that his arguments were deeply flawed. Let us not forget that the white South believed it to be of vital interest to its welfare that the experiment of Negro suffrage should fail ignominiously, and that almost to a man the whites were willing to ensure this failure either by active force or passive acquiescence. That same year, Du Bois left Atlanta and moved to New York City to help start the NAACP and its magazine, The Crisis. Margaret Mitchell's exposure to the Civil War and Reconstruction continued to develop during the same period. In 1915, when she was 15 years old, Mitchell began to work on a play adapting The Traitor, a novel by popular author Thomas Dixon Jr. You might be familiar with Dixon as the author of the second book in the Traitor series, The Klansman, a novel that lionized the Ku Klux Klan as heroic rescuers of white womanhood and portrayed black men as lascivious beasts. In 1915, The Klansman was adapted into the first American blockbuster film, The Birth of a Nation. It was incredibly popular, and it, along with the lynching of Leo Frank in August 1915, helped instigate the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan on the top of Stone Mountain on Thanksgiving Day the same year. Mitchell began corresponding with Dixon after she published Gone with the Wind and wrote that she was practically raised on his books and loved them very much. Du Bois, shockingly, was not a fan. He was deeply concerned about the cultural impact of Dixon's books and The Birth of a Nation. Du Bois was so worried about Dixon, in fact, that he threatened to switch publishers. He and Dixon both worked with Doubleday. Both Mitchell and Du Bois began writing Gone with the Wind and Black Reconstruction in earnest in the late 1920s. Mitchell started in 1926 after an ankle injury trapped her at home. She often talked about how she read her way through the Carnegie Library, and her husband, John, sick of bringing her stacks of books, brought her a stack of paper and told her to write her own book. Atlanta History Center owns that desk, by the way. It's on display at the Margaret Mitchell House. Du Bois began writing Black Reconstruction in 1929 for very different reasons. That year, journalist and Democratic politician Claude Bowers published a history of Reconstruction. He entitled it The Tragic Era, the Revolution After Lincoln. The Tragic Era is what we would now call a book of popular history. It took academic arguments like Dunning's, sprinkled in racially charged and melodramatic lost cause tales, and made it all readable for the general audience. It accomplished its mission. It was even selected as a Literary Guild title for 1929. The Philadelphia Inquirer called it our most vivid record of the Reconstruction period, a brilliant effort that is in every page alive. Activists like Anna J. Cooper begged Du Bois to push back. My dear Dr. Du Bois, it seems to me that the tragic era should be answered adequately, fully, ably, finally, and again that seems to me that thou art the man. Will you do it? Answer. Claude Bowers and the Tragic Era just didn't have an impact on Du Bois. Margaret Mitchell read the book as well. In fact, passages or arguments in the Tragic Era appear in almost identical forms in Gone with the Wind. You can see on the left, the Tragic Era, Bowers wrote, the freedmen clung to the illusion planted in their minds by demagogues that the economic status of the races was to be reversed by the distribution of land among them. This cruelly false hope was being fed by private soldiers, bureau agents, and low northern whites, circulating amongst the Negroes on terms of social equality and the cultivation of their prospective votes. And on the right, in Gone with the Wind, Mitchell wrote, formerly their white masters had given the orders. Now they had a new set of masters, the bureaus and the carpetbaggers. And their orders were, you're just as good as any white man, so act that way. Just as soon as you can vote the Republican ticket, you're going to have the white man's property. It's as good as yours now. Take it if you can. Mitchell and Du Bois both worked for years to research their books. There was even some overlap in their sources. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever spent time looking in the back of a 760-page history books and looking at source lists. They don't usually look like this, but they'd be a lot more interesting if they did. Du Bois went to the trouble not only of listing his sources, but of cataloging their genre and perspective. Some historians, for example, are described as fair to indifferent to the Negro. Other works are described as propaganda that attempts to prove that the South was right in Reconstruction, the North was vengeful or deceived, and the Negro stupid. It's worth noting that one of the sources of Du Bois of the sources Du Bois and Mitchell shared, two fall in the latter category. One is Claude Bower's The Tragic Era, and the other is a book by Atlanta author and friend of Margaret Mitchell, Murda Avery. Avery's works obviously influenced Gone with the Wind, so much so that a passage of it appears word for word in Mitchell's novel, used to explain the politics of Reconstruction by Mitchell's omniscient narrator. This stuff isn't the characters' perspectives. It's intended to be neutral background information. The differences between Mitchell and Du Bois' use of these sources reveals the impact of their very different perspectives on the same text. In other words, two people can read the same piece of information and take away opposite conclusions. Like most modern historians, Du Bois approached these sources skeptically and kept their potential biases in mind. Mitchell, it seems, to have taken them at face value. Not only do books like Avery's appear in Mitchell's historical background, they also appear in the plot of Gone with the Wind. Scarlett and Rhett's scandalous dancing while she's in full mourning at a bazaar, the details of Ellen's relationship with Mammy, Rhett's life as a blockade runner, it's all there. Perhaps most notable is the iconic story of Scarlett, Melanie, Rhett, and Prissy fleeing burning Atlanta in a collapsing cart drawn by an abused Yankee horse, which is eerily similar to the story told by Mary Ann Harris Gay in her memoir, Life in Dixie During the War. For Mitchell, the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction was bound up in personal memory. All of her grandparents were former Confederates, as were many of her friends. The impassioned words of authors like Murda Avery and Claude Bowers, written 40 to 65 years after the war, felt like facts to her. She even said as much. Practically all of the incidents in the book are true. Of course, they didn't all happen to the same person, and a few of them didn't happen in Atlanta. I had to tone down the numbers of incidents to make them barely credible, so I get a loud laugh when reviewers speak of the book being too melodramatic. Mitchell was worried about historical accuracy in Gone with the Wind. As she put it, she didn't want her former Confederate relatives coming down her like a duck on a June bug if something was amiss. Our intrepid researcher took one for the team and took on the task of reading the 34 Confederate memoirs we know Mitchell used to research Gone with the Wind, and from which he got these stories. Our conclusion, they are certainly melodramatic, but barely credible. We're not so sure about true. To Du Bois, Mitchell's sources felt like something else entirely. In the final chapter of Black Reconstruction, he wrote, "It is propaganda like this that has led men in the past to insist that history is lies agreed upon. No amount of flowery romance and personal reminiscences of its protected beneficiaries can keep the world from knowing that slavery was a cruel, dirty, costly, and inexcusable anachronism which nearly ruined the world's greatest experiment in democracy." Boy, he could write. The results of these very different perspectives were two works with completely different messages. First, in 1935, there's Black Reconstruction, a towering academic work filled with well-researched points and expertly crafted arguments, highlighting the effects of slavery and the ways that white Southerners attempted to recreate it after emancipation. And then, in 1936, there was Gone with the Wind, a novel of over 1,000 pages filled with fascinating characters and riveting drama, equally painstakingly researched to very different results. For the sake of melodrama and the author's conception of accuracy, Gone with the Wind portrays slavery positively. It also argues that Reconstruction was the astonishing spectacle of a half a nation at the attempt of the bayonet to force upon the other half of the rule of Negroes, many of whom were scarcely one generation out of the jungle. William McDonald, a history professor at Yale, reviewed Black Reconstruction for the New York Times in 1935. He called it a stirring, bitterly eloquent brief for the part the American Negro played in the effort to create an egalitarian democracy of black and white alike in the post-Civil War South. He also questioned some of Du Bois's work. His attempt to analyze slavery and emancipation through a Marxist lens, he used the word dictatorship a lot, dictatorship of capital, dictatorship of the proletariat, wasn't MacDonald's favorite interpretive lens, and it didn't hold up very well with other scholars as well. Gone with the Wind got a Times review as well. It took a slightly different tone and called Gone with the Wind, beyond a doubt, one of the most remarkable first novels produced by an American writer. It was also one of the best, and it's a long while since the American reading public has been offered such a bounteous feast of excellent storytelling. The differing popular appeal of these books reflected the wider appeal of novels over Marxist-laden histories, to be sure, but it also reflected the tense racial environment that plagued the Jim Crow South era in the United States. The fictional work of a white woman that reproduced inaccurate and biased versions of history was quickly accepted as fact and lauded as a literary masterpiece. It even won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1937. But the nonfiction work of a black man with a PhD was questioned because the author treated black and white historical figures as equally influential, important, and human. And in the spirit of the 1930s, America, because he peppered in a boatload of Marxist jargon, including letters from Karl Marx to Reconstruction era political figures, including Ulysses S. Grant, he also took hits for that. Mitchell and Du Bois read the same books, were interested in the same topics, and lived in the same places. But that certainly doesn't mean they appreciate each other's works. When asked what he thought of the film version of Gone with the Wind, Du Bois said that while Birth of a Nation was dangerous, Gone with the Wind was conventional provincialism about which Negroes need not get excited. Mitchell wrote to her editor, Harold Latham, about her frustrations with communists who had been using my book to sweep the Southern Negroes into the Communist Party, even as abolitionists once used Uncle Tom's Cabin to rally Northern anti-slavery sentiment. Du Bois was a passionate Marxist, just the sort of Northern Negro communist Mitchell was writing about. Mitchell and Du Bois's interpretations of the same books, the same periods in history, the same people, and the same institutions was completely different because of segregation's impact on their lives and American thought. Today, the impacts of Gone with the Wind and Black Reconstruction have changed. Though Gone with the Wind remains an icon of American popular culture, the flaws in its historical background are acknowledged by historians. After Du Bois's death in 1963, Black Reconstruction grew in popularity to become an essential foundational element of modern scholarship on the Civil War and Reconstruction. When we showed our work on Mitchell and Du Bois to Du Bois's Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, David Levering Lewis, this February, he told us that the connections between these two were historians' catnip. Through this intellectual exercise today, I hope you see that it points out something about 1930s America that's just as true about America in 2025. Though the topics we disagree on might be different than they were back then, it's still possible for two intelligent, interesting, and talented people to examine the same information and walk away with vastly different conclusions based on their personal experiences, communities, and ingrained narratives. I want to make clear, in this example, we see one of those perspectives, Du Bois, without the Marxist dogma, stood the test of time. One ultimately bore up the facts and history and the other did not. But in the fog of the present, at the time, it would have been almost impossible for an outside observer to know which one was that would become to the outside observer the winner, because the observer was also probably deep into the soup. Perhaps our disagreements today aren't as stark as the differences between Margaret Mitchell and Du Bois, or you might argue they are. Either way, these stories are examples of why we study history. Time gives us clarity and perspective to see these diverging paths, illuminating our own circumstances and constraints that we might not even be aware of in our own busy lives. History gives us the opportunity for perspective in our own time. Thank you.
Sheffield, thank you for that fascinating research and historical perspective, if not jarring somewhat. We've got some time for a few questions. There's a microphone over there. Zach's the first one up again.
Hey, Sheffield. I've got a couple of questions. One of them is, what do you think would have happened if Abraham Lincoln had not died before Reconstruction? And the difference between Lincoln and Johnson and their attitudes towards the South. And secondly, do you think that Du Bois would have been received differently had he not been so connected to the Communist Party?
Well, on the first counterfactual question, most people in my shoes, would dodge that because who knows. But in the end of the day, the South was very resistant to change, and it would have, whatever Lincoln had done, it would have been better, maybe, but there would still been that strong resistance to blacks being able to vote, and so I think you would have ended up in the same place. Lincoln would have obviously been better than Johnson. That's a low bar, but who knows what would have happened. And as the second, as the Marxist, when you read Black Reconstruction, it is really jarring to read all the communist language that's in there, Marxist language. But if you read past it, you get a great book. And I think it would have helped if it hadn't had that Marxist lens, but he was also an African-American professor in the 1930s, and he's not going to be able to, it was hard to break through. But it didn't help, that's for damn sure, that he was a Marxist.
Well, giving him credit, Marxism hadn't been debunked in the 1930s when he was living, as it has since the fall of communist Russia.
Yeah, it was more in the intellectual firmament, and there were more people that were engaged with it at that time than there would be now, that's for sure.
Yes, go ahead, Chloe.
Sheffield, thanks as always for providing education and history. And I know you've always taught me that you just share the history and people will develop their own perspectives. But as we are a year away from the 250th anniversary of our democracy, and we still seem to be in some ways in different echo chambers, is there something, some guidance, some advice you'd have for us as Rotarians to think about how to bridge some of the understanding across those echo chambers?
Well, I think if you could do better than me and exercise in humility, because I try, it's hard. But in terms of what you know, in terms of what you hear and where you get your information and question it, that's really the main thing that you can do, and give people time to talk and see if you can find some common ground. I mean, it's kindergarten stuff, but that's really where we need to be focused on, I think, in the coming year. I mean, everything that's going on now has just made us more relevant at the History Center in terms of what we do, and the way we deal with our guiding principles, and the way we talk to people, and the way we don't label and shame people, and the way we try to get the facts and give people the opportunity to hear and perspective. And so if we could do that in our own lives and give people the opportunity to have perspective, but not necessarily go try to change their mind, which shuts people down, then you might get further along that way. That's what we found, or at least we're trying to model that behavior, even if I don't do it personally.
Thank you, and thank you for all that you do.
Sheffield, I want to end off with a softball. What sparked your interest in this research, and what's coming up at the History Center that we should all be aware of?
Well, there's nobody that we know of who put these two cats in the same room, okay? And when we were doing the exhibit at Margaret Mitchell House that opened up, I reread Gone with the Wind, but I also collect books, and I had the first edition of Black Reconstruction, and it's 1935. Mitchell's book was 1936. They're both in the same town. This is crazy. This is Atlanta. This is a great story. And what if they had met? I'm still seeking a playwright for that. But you've got these two strong characters. To me, that's what sparked the interest in it. And we included Du Bois in the exhibit. And we found all sorts of information, like Walter White, the secretary of the NAACP wrote a letter to Selznick, he was doing the film, saying you should get your screenwriters to read Black Reconstruction. That's crazy, right? I mean, that was, all of a sudden these things started getting closer together. So that's why we've gone into this. That's why I made this poor woman read 34 Confederate memoirs. And, you know, and that's when we started finding out all of these stories that really nobody had talked about that Margaret Mitchell had gleaned from all these places. So a lot of the things that are in the book are directly out of other places, which she was proud of because that was, to her, that was research.
That's amazing. Thank you for being here at short notice. Thank you for being humble. Thank you for everything you do at the History Center. Next week, we have Senator Raphael Warnock coming to the club. I sadly will not be here. Thank you, Past President Yates, for stepping up to lead the program next week. That'll be a sellout, so please answer whether you are coming with guests. There will be no Rotary, obviously, for Memorial Day, but we'll be back on June the 2nd, when Erica James, the Dean of the Wharton School, will be here to address us. So with that, I hope everybody has a good rest of your Monday. This meeting is adjourned.